Okay, here's a scenario. You're waiting in line at the grocery store, and in front of you are a parent with their babbling infant. And the infant is going like, Wabi! And you wonder, how the hell does anyone understand what the kid is saying? Well, first off, good question. Second, I'm sadly not going to answer that question. What I am going to talk to you about, however, is what are the main processes and steps in language acquisition? How do infants go from cries to babbles, from babbles to words, and eventually to asking you for a video game? But first, why do we even care about infant language skills? Well, that's simple. First, it's very useful to express their basic needs and desires, such as, I want to pee or I'm hungry. And then they also enable children to absorb knowledge much more effectively. But beyond that, research actually found that early language skills, such as a large vocabulary or phonological awareness, predict both literacy and mathematics results later in life. In other words, better understanding how we learn language can help devise programs for children with delays and prevent long-term negative impacts. Now, the thing is, not everyone is equal when it comes to language learning, and one of the most solid findings on this topic is the stark disparity between kids from rich and poor backgrounds. At 2 years of age, kids from high socioeconomic status families already have up to 6 month head start as compared to their low SES family counterparts. Okay, language is important. Now, infants and young children have a unique ability to learn language very, very fast and very, very efficiently. They can learn dozens of words every week, and they can also grasp linguistic rules and regularities extremely quickly in a way that adults simply cannot. And you've heard them try, you've heard my accent, you know what I'm talking about. So now, is it time to freak out for little Jamie, who is already 2 years old and still hasn't uttered the shortest sentence? Well, no, don't worry. In fact, there are many, many things that we have to learn when we acquire language, and many of those can occur without speaking. We have to learn the sounds of the language, those are phonetics. We have to learn the overall musical envelope of the language, prosody. We also have to learn the vocabulary and how to identify, how to locate and parse words within the audio input that we get. This is segmentation and lexical learning. At birth, infants are already sensitive to some of those, such as prosody. That's the music of the language when the tone goes up or down. And when in the mother's womb, a fetus actually hears a low-pass filtered version of the mother's voice, and from that, they already get familiar with those characteristics. For instance, they'll be able to differentiate English, a stress-based language, and French, a syllable-based language, and even between two foreign languages when they have different rhythms. But that's not where newborn abilities stop. Abu Banal actually explored sensitivity to other phonotactic regularities, such as the iambo-trochaic law. And this is something we kind of all feel without knowing that it's called that way. It's the idea when there are two syllables of varying duration, loudness, or pitch, they usually feature the longest one last, so that's the iambic grouping, but the loudest or highest one first, and that's trochaic grouping. So when I say happy, you hear happy. The higher ha, louder ha, but longer p. And this is actually language specific, which means that each language has its own distribution, like its own rule regarding it. And in fact, we observe that newborns are sensitive to the iambo-trochaic law with respect to the statistical distribution of their native language. To get a little bit technical here, what they did was use a near-infrared spectroscopy study to look at the brain activation difference in newborns between when they were exposed to language congruent samples, so with prosodic patterns matching the regularities of the language, and language incongruent ones. And what was shown for French, a language with strong duration cues but weak to non-existent pitch and loudness cues, is that infants actually discriminated between congruent and incongruent samples only in the duration condition. As for bilingual children whose second language had pitch cues, they also discriminated for pitch, suggesting that even though it is not relevant or not necessarily relevant in French, It augmented their sensitivity to that property. Now, not all prosodic properties are present at birth. Some others, such as stress patterns, are acquired by 6 to 9 months of age, and those are overall helpful to learn new words through something called prosodic bootstrapping. The idea is basically that infants use prosodic regularities, for instance, where words are usually stressed, to parse words and therefore identify new ones. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Before learning words, infants need to learn the sounds of the language, so that's between when infants start cooing, around 2 to 4 months of age, and babbling by 6 to 10 months. So essentially, phonemes are the basic sounds of the language, and they're different for all languages. And what infants have to learn is how to recognize these sounds and how to understand which differences are meaningful, such as the ones between b and p, and which ones are not. And those would be the differences in the way that I pronounce a, based on my accent, based on the speed of speech, based on my timbre, on co-articulation variables, etc. So acoustically, what we perceive can be represented as a set of frequencies or formants, and on a spectrogram we can actually recognize vowels as being the states of high energy, the steady states of high energy, and the consonant as being the transient states. And actually, phonemes can be quite well characterized by the shape and height of their first three formants. Interestingly, the mechanisms through which we perceive consonants and vowels are not the same, and to begin with consonants, they are perceived on a categorical scale. What this means is that different instances of a same consonant are actually not discriminated. Lieberman and al. Actually demonstrated categorical perception of consonants in a very convincing way. They started from canonical b, d, and g samples, and they artificially generated intermediate sounds as combination of neighboring ones. And what they then did was to ask participants in a 3 alternative forced choice task which one they heard. And the results strikingly demonstrate that participants ascribed the input to the closest category and never to some intermediate sound. Well, I see you coming. It's not just the lack of label for intermediate sounds, because some discrimination tasks and not identification tasks also showed that there was no discrimination of samples within a category, but there was accurate distinction of samples across category boundaries. In addition, this categorization process is language specific, with categories being language general at birth and until 4 months of age, and starting to shift and adapt to the native language until about 10 months of age, when the process is final. And to illustrate this phenomenon, just take the famous example of the English sounds R and L. In Japanese, there is only some sort of R sound, which I cannot perfectly pronounce, of course, which is in between R and L. And because of this, Japanese speakers usually struggle to differentiate these sounds. And to be fair, French speakers similarly often fail at producing the sound, which often turns into a clumsy z sound. Though beware not to mistake in behavioral distinction and perceptual distinction. So if people cannot discriminate between two different instances of a consonant, studies have shown differences in electroencephalogram measurements, so in brain responses, both for within category and for across category changes. What this essentially means is that the fact that we don't seem to discriminate between utterances of a same consonant does not mean that our brain and ears don't perceive them to be different. Okay, now, contrary to consonants, vowels are perceived on a continuous scale, even for non-native contrasts. However, there are still biases in the way that we perceive them. Humans, but unlike for other results, this is not true for monkeys, display an effect we call prototype or magnet effect. And the idea is that among the ways to pronounce the vowel A, some are more prototypical or standard, and some are less so. And discrimination of instances which are close to the prototypes is harder than discrimination of ones that are further from the prototype. In other words, if you listen first to a prototypical A and then to a non-prototypical A, you'll have a harder time discriminating between the two than if you first hear the non-prototypical A and then the prototypical one. And in fact, although we're sensitive to non-native vowel contrasts, the magnet effect is stronger in the native language already at 6 months of age. Now, all this that I've been describing can be fit into a model, and the best one that we have at this point is the attunement model, a compromise stating that we are born with some initial abilities, but then we develop and build some more based on the input we receive. So we're left with some kind of chicken and egg problem. Do we first learn words or learn how to locate them within a speech stream? Because, yeah, unlike written language with spaces as artificial boundaries between words, spoken language requires an additional level of skill to parse between the words. And when adults can rely on lexicon to just know, okay, that was a word, let's put a break here and start a new one, well, infants cannot. What has been shown is that there are at least two main methods for infants to be able to segment words before they even know the words. The first one is prosody, and the second one is distributional cues. Regarding prosody, infants have been shown to be able to use rhythmic units, syllables, or syntactic stress, as well as overall prosodic melodies as cues indicating the start and ending of phrases. For instance, at 7.5 months old, infants have been used to be able to segment likely patterns, such as trochaic words in English but not iambic words. For instance, for the word doctor, the strong syllable is the first one, and that is a cue that infants were able to use in order to determine that that strong syllable was the first one in a word. By 6 to 12 months of age, infants start to be able to learn to parse monosyllables. And French native infants are actually better than English native infants because syllables are the rhythmic unit of French, so it carries more meaning in French. And interestingly, by 16 months of age, infants are now able to segment bisyllables, so two syllables at once. But at that point, they no longer recognize single syllables when they are embedded within a larger context. And these segmentation abilities also depend on previously known words. Example: children learn much earlier to parse a single syllable when it follows a word they know. So this means that known words can then, once learned, serve as markers to help segmentation of the following word. Now, regarding distributional properties, what has been shown is that infants can rely on phonotactic constraints starting from about 9 months. They know that some sequences of sounds are not legal in their language or perhaps very rare, enabling them to put a word boundary there. And experiments also showed reliance on statistical regularities, such as the fact that a word is a sequence of sounds which occur more often jointly than with other sounds. And this was interestingly shown in an experiment with artificial words, artificial three-syllable words such as peekaboo, which were repeated one after the other in an endless sequence without prosodic cues. And the infants actually picked up on the regularities and realized that some of the syllables occurred together, co-occurred more often than others, and based on that, they were able to retrieve which words were actually the initial words comprising the excerpt. This ability to segment based on distributional properties is modulated by input and babbling. In fact, word segmentation based on distributional properties is better with more input at 4 months, more babbling at 8 months, and stronger vocabulary at 12 months. And thank you guys for keeping up with me until now. This is the end of the video because I don't have much more to say, and I hope that it was useful or at least interesting.